transition to net zero from a developing country perspective. So this session marks a special moment for us at TESS, and particularly for me, and I hope for the authors, as we are proud to officially launch our new compilation of sectoral briefing notes from our flagship policy series, Trade, Climate and Net Zero Pathways, Scenarios and Implications for Developing Countries and Climate Resilient Development. This compilation is the result of almost a year of collaborative research with leading experts in those sectors. And it gives an overview of emerging transformations in policy trends in production and trade in key sectors in the context of the unfolding climate crisis and the international community's climate action, while focusing on implications for developing countries and their interests. It then explores and identifies trade policy and cooperation options to support developing countries in navigating transformations in those sectors while fostering their competitiveness, equity, and resilience. So the compilation is now online, and I invite you to check it on our website. It includes 9 sectors: agriculture, carbon markets, fisheries, shipping, and heavy industry. But today, we're delighted to have authors who will speak about 4 sectors: energy transition, critical minerals, digital transformation, textiles, and garments. Each of these sectors faces distinct pressures and opportunities on the net zero pathways. Our speakers today are the authors or co-authors of the corresponding briefing notes. They will share their findings, followed by reflections from Geneva-based developing countries WTO delegates, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Let me start by quickly introducing our experts and discussants. I'm pleased to welcome on energy transition, on my far right, Ellie Belton, who is Senior Policy Advisor on Trade Climate in the third generation environmentalism, E3G. Ellie co-authored the note on energy transition with Beth Walker, who leads E3G's work on international energy diplomacy, but she couldn't join us today. On critical minerals, on my left, Peter Wooders, co-founder and lead on renewables at Geneva Platform for Resilient Value Chains, also housed at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And Peter co-authored the note with Simon Lobach, postdoctoral researcher, University of Vienna, Swiss National Science Foundation, and who is with us in the room. On digital transformation, Nadira BAYAT is joining us online, Senior Sustainable Development Policy Specialist, and she's an independent consultant on digital trade as well. And I had the pleasure to co-author this note with her. On textiles and garments, I have on my right, TARIQ SCHRODER, Senior Research Fellow, Environment and Society Center at the Chatham House. We also have an excellent lineup of discussants to share national developing countries' experiences and views on trade opportunities and challenges in those sectors. Naeem TARIQ, he's the Legal Affairs Officer at the Permanent Mission of Pakistan to the WTO. Kekalesto Mashigo, Counselor, Permanent Mission of South Africa to the WTO. And Noor Kagri Karabag, I hope I'm pronouncing right, Commercial Counselor, Permanent Mission of Turkey to the WTO. I know how busy your schedule is this week, and I'm very thankful for making the time to be with us today. Let me now give the floor, without further ado, to our experts. Our experts today were invited to speak about their sectoral notes and their findings in light of the following guiding questions. What are the key trade-related transformations expected or already happening in your sector under the net zero transition pathways, what trade-related measures and industrial policies can developing countries leverage to support climate resilient development amid these shifts, and how can international cooperation at the nexus of trade and climate be harnessed or reformed to enable equitable participation of developing countries in your sector's value chains. I'm going to start with Ellie on energy transition. Ellie, you have the floor and you have 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Yasmin. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here today, and lovely to see so many people in the room. So as Yasmin mentioned, I authored this paper with my colleague Beth Walker, who isn't here today, but she leads E3G's work on energy transition, and I lead our work on trade. So the energy transition is rapidly accelerating, and it's is already and will continue to reshape both global geopolitics and trade flows, which could offer huge opportunities for global development. But many countries are struggling to take advantage of these opportunities without better investment and international coordination. So globally, we now invest twice as much in clean energy as we do in fossil fuels, but only 15% of this occurs outside of developed economies and China. Many developing countries that we looked at in our paper are rich in natural resources that we need for renewable energy, including abundant energy potential, so that's solar and wind power, and reserves of critical minerals. But they face significant investment barriers, including high capital costs, inadequate infrastructure, project risks, and high levels of debt, which make it very difficult to turn these resources into economic opportunity. So to take the example of the continent of Africa, there is capacity for solar reserves to meet 30% of global supply from the continent of Africa, and yet it only attracts around 2% of global renewable energy investment. So there's a big gap. So to move on to some of the trade-related transformations that we expect. So as the energy transition evolves, fossil fuel exporters are going to lose market share and political leverage as the global demand for clean energy increases. Now, this will have a disproportionate impact on developing countries, which are typically dependent on export-led growth and face significant investment barriers, as I mentioned. And so they will be forced to explore alternative development pathways. We've also seen this year growing protectionist sentiment, which is increasing trade barriers, limiting market access to the products that we need for the energy transition, and also reducing prospects for international cooperation. And these geopolitical tensions mean that we're also struggling to see some multilateral commitments to increase renewables capacity turning into action. And also quickly to note the regionalization of global trade. So with countries increasingly looking towards bilateral partnerships to advance their energy transitions instead of seeking multilateral climate solutions, there's a particularly high risk of this in the energy sector, because renewables are typically produced close to local demand centers and not transported over long distances in the same way as fossil fuels. So we should see big transformations in that regard as well. Now, to move onto the trade-related measures that can support climate resilient development in the energy transition. The first thing is continuing to participate in international dialogues and coalitions to support fossil fuel phase out. And this needs to be about reducing production, not just reducing demand. But we also see a big responsibility for developed economies, particularly G7 and G20 economies, to lead the way here on areas like fossil fuel subsidy reform and reform of ISDS, so investor-state dispute settlement clauses in investment treaties. Another important area we think is strengthening bilateral trade partnerships to help build renewable energy value chains in developing countries. This can offer mutually beneficial win-win outcomes by increasing market access, securing investment, facilitating regulatory cooperation, and creating new export opportunities. And we also need to see a continued drive to reform trade policy at the multilateral level, So that includes reducing harmful incentives, such as fossil fuel subsidies. They should be assessed on their environmental impact and not just on their trade distorting impact, and also mitigating the impact of unilateral measures, such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which also covers some energy-related products. So to wrap up, to focus on the role of international cooperation in this space going forward, it's clear that we need to find a way through the institutional challenges that we face, both at the WTO and at the UNFCCC. We are excited by the prospect of a new initiative being launched by the Brazilian presidency, COP30, which could create a new forum to discuss some of the issues at the nexus of trade and climate and the energy transition. And our energy team, who I mentioned, so my colleague Beth, they are working on another proposition around developing a global dialogue on fossil fuel transition. So this would look at exploring different transition scenarios for developing countries, developing country-specific roadmaps and pathways, identifying the enabling conditions and cooperation mechanisms that we need, and crucially delivering long-term commitments so that we can see progress going forward far beyond 2026. Thanks, Yasmin.
Thank you so much. Perfect timing. I'm not going to try to summarize everything you said, but I think the most important points you highlighted is the greatest opportunities for developing countries when it comes to renewable energy, but the constraints they are facing in order to leverage this advantage. And at the same time, the importance for developed countries to lead on cutting out on fossil fuel subsidies and have a cooperative pathway with developing countries in order to identify or shape a pathway of transition away from fossil fuel subsidies and supporting renewable energy with a lot of more positive incentives rather than reducing the harmful incentives in international cooperation. I'm going to move now to Peter, who will talk to us about a very linked issue to this renewable energy discussion, which is critical minerals. So Peter, the floor is yours. You have 5 to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. And thank you also to TESS, both for organising the session today and for all your support with the paper and for helping us to bring it to a nice conclusion. I think that everybody's talking about critical minerals at the moment. And I suppose the natural reaction to that would be, therefore, is there lots of money to be made from them? And I think the answer there is maybe. I'm sorry about that. But let's dig into that first by looking a little bit at the market itself. Growing very, very rapidly. So the market for critical minerals is likely to be 2 to 4 times as big in 2040, 15 years from now, as it is now. And that disguises some very strong growth areas, for example, in lithium, which may be 10 times as big. When we talk about critical minerals as well, this is a combination of both minerals that you'd be very used, very conventional, very normal minerals that you're very used to seeing discussed, copper and nickel, aluminium and manganese are often included in that list as well. And then some more sort of exotic minerals around the rare earths and so on. So some of these are bulk minerals that are used for many, many purposes, and others are very specialized. But what we see in both is that conventional demand for these minerals is not likely to be going down anytime soon. So the extra minerals that are required for the energy transition and for batteries and solar panels and wind and everything else are additional. So this is all extra demand. In terms of where we are with meeting the supply, one of the references we looked at said there is about 20% of the minerals we need in 2035, so 10 years from now, are yet to be found. So most of them are found, but there's still some to be done. And when we look at there's long lead times here. So most of the minerals that we need are already found, a lot of them already developed, a lot of them already owned. So changing the paths of ownership and profitability in the sector is a relatively long-term project. The minerals themselves are spread around. From the group of delegates today, I think South Africa probably has the largest endowments here, including 36% of the world's manganese, which is an important mineral as we look forward into both energy transition, but other sources as well. The minerals are increasingly strategic, but that really hasn't yet been priced in. So when you look at the prices for most critical minerals, they're relatively low. They're not, the companies involved are not making huge amounts of profit. And we can look at that and say, is that situation going to continue, or will they become more profitable in the future? And it's not clear. You know? Just because they're critical and there's lots of attention on them doesn't mean they're highly profitable. Again, there's also been discussion about environmental and social considerations. Should there be premium paid in the market if nickel is more green or is produced in a more socially responsible way? There have been initiatives on this side, but again, there isn't much premium in the market at the moment. That may well develop, and I think it's something that developing in other countries should look out for, but it hasn't happened yet. And I think the last couple of observations on the market at the moment is critical mineral mining is very, very similar to conventional mineral mining. So it comes with the same issues and the same challenges. It's highly capital intensive, it's risky, prices are volatile, there are very strong impacts socially, environmentally, on the climate, but mostly locally. There can be delays, there can be risks from substitution. You know, other minerals may come in for purposes. And we see as well, again, one final observation on the current market is that the processing and downstream sectors are highly dominated by China in almost all cases. The one major exception is nickel, where there is large Chinese ownership and interest in that sector within Indonesia as well, in the processing there. And those markets also tend to be fairly low margin, high volume, and high barriers to entry. So these are, you know, it's far from clear that there's lots of money to be made in these markets. Looking at trade, growing markets, 10% per year, average growth trade rate in critical minerals over the past 20 years. In general, imports are not constrained. People want critical minerals. There are some taxes on imports, largely on aluminium, on batteries, sometimes on steel, in large emerging economies, typically India, Brazil, and the US is clearly putting tariffs on copper and other things at present at the moment. And so rather than being lots of constraints or taxes on imports, what we more see is countries trying to encourage imports and access to those critical minerals through, for example, the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership. The first one of those was signed between the EU and South Africa. I think we looked towards the end of last year, looking for, and I think this is a very interesting model, if it goes to the end point, where countries who want extra access to critical minerals may be willing to invest in third countries and give conditions to those countries in order to secure those supplies. So is there a basis here of a deal? And I think this is a key point that comes out in a lot of the critical mineral analysis is, even if profit is not high at the moment and prospects are risky and so on, because there's such strong interest in these minerals, those countries that have the assets have higher negotiating power. And it's then, how could that higher negotiating power be used? We see on the trade, typical trade measures are possible if you want to further develop domestic resources, local content requirements, subsidies, import taxes, whatever. I think the literature there shows that got to go into this with very open eyes, compare the costs, compare the benefits. It can work, it cannot work. But a lot of the attention at the moment has been on exports and export restrictions, with the case of nickel in Indonesia being perhaps the most talked about. And it's a mixed history. I think in terms of nickel in Indonesia, in rare earths in China, in palladium and diamonds in Zimbabwe, not critical minerals, but important minerals, there has been an encouragement there of further downstream industry. In the case of Mongolia, when it tried to, when it restricted exports of coal, of copper, of fluorspar, and in many countries on bauxite, it hasn't been successful. And we've seen countries move away from investment. And I think one of the key things that comes out of two of the key things that come out of this with export restrictions are, if you are going to restrict exports, it's important to have market power, so a large share of that market, and it's important to have the capacity of building up your downstream industry. And these are sort of key considerations there. Export taxes have been used to raise revenue. Generally, they have worked in that, but have often reduced investment. And there's always this sort of ongoing point. It's good to improve the general trade infrastructure, harmonize regulations and standards, cluster industry, etc. In terms of international cooperation, I think we've got examples in the paper, but I think it comes down to sort of two or three things. Firstly, countries have increased negotiating power. Secondly, as far as possible, reduce local specificities. Don't have standards that are very particular to countries, regulations that are very particular to countries. The more they're harmonized, the better. And then I think a piece of advice we give from the paper is it is key to prepare for future markets. Future markets may well have premia for better environmental and social performance. That's also in the interest of the country developing the resource or the downstream industry. So good to factor those in as well. It's really hard to conclude sort of advice, general advice on a sector as complicated as critical minerals. There's so many minerals, so many countries, so many contexts. But I think we'd say, you know, assets are in very strong demand. That gives negotiating power. Developing those assets either upstream or through downstream is still economically risky. There are still serious environmental and social and governance issues that come with mining and with downstream industries. And then perhaps the focus would be, given that there's extra attention from other countries about these resources, that gives countries with those assets the ability to say what do they want? Yeah? What do you want out of this deal? Do you want to encourage downstream industry? Do you want something entirely different from a trade negotiation, but it gives negotiating power, which something can be built from? Sorry for going slightly over here.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. I think your 4 bullet points at the end summarized in a big sense your contribution today. So I'm not gonna add to this, but thank you so much. And I'm gonna move now to Nadira, who is joining us online. Nadira, you have 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Yasmin. And thank you to TESS for the opportunity to contribute to this very important series. Greetings to all from Lusaka, Zambia, and it really is a pleasure to present insights from the sectoral note that I co-authored with Yasmin on digital transformation, trade, climate, and net zero pathways. Now, the digital sector is indispensable to climate action. It optimizes energy systems, it cuts waste, enables adaptation and resilience. But at the same time, the sector is a rapidly growing source of greenhouse gases. It's currently responsible for an estimated 1.4% to 4% of global GHG emissions. And of course, the footprint is largely driven by the sector's backbone, data centers and cloud services, which are both highly energy and water intensive. And with the surging demand from artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency operations, the electricity use in data centers is projected to increase significantly. Now, the twin transition captures this reality. Green and digital transformation are interconnected and unfolding simultaneously, and it's really the policy choices that will determine whether digital accelerates or undermines net zero goals. Now, precisely because the footprint is set to grow when it needs to shrink, our digital transformation note sets out 5 priority pathways for decarbonization of the digital sector. So let's start where the footprint is the heaviest, the engine room of the internet, the data centers. Now, in practice, that means running facilities on renewables and ensuring every efficiency gain from cooling operations. And because data centers account for a sizable share of ICT emissions, hosting, cloud, and AI workloads are now gravitating to locations with clean, reliable power and strong connectivity. So this creates significant digital export opportunities. And we are already seeing this in Kenya, for example. Kenya is leveraging its green electricity mix to position itself as an East African data center hub. But there are also a number of challenges. There's high capital and operating costs, there's grid unreliability, and limited access to finance constraints. So we really see those opportunities and challenges. And similarly, when we look at the green and energy efficient ICT operations and digital trade logistics, which is also high emissions, there are significant opportunities and challenges here too. Now, this is really about as platforms and buyers starting to pay closer attention to life cycle emissions, the demand is rising for low carbon digital services and e-commerce logistics solutions. Countries that offer renewable power data and fulfillment plus energy efficient low emission delivery create opportunities for digital exports and integrating MSMEs into green value chains. A number of good practice examples. For example, India's e-commerce fleets are going electric at scale. Kenya's last mile pilots are moving to e-bikes, but there are also hurdles. Many grids are still fossil heavy and unreliable, and clean kits cost more. Last mile delivery also increases the cost of diesel, and the fragmented rules make it hard to scale new models. If we want trust when we're looking at sustainable and transparent digital supply chains, we have to be able to prove what's in our products and how they are made. So buyers are shifting from tell me to show me. And market access increasingly depends on verifiable data on origin, ESG performance, and carbon footprint. So here again, digital solutions, digital traceability, AI, Internet of Things, blockchain backed by credible measurement and reporting provides that proof. And for developing countries, this is a particular opportunity to move beyond raw exports into certified higher value roles in electronics and in battery chains, but provided that institutions and data systems are able to keep up. And that's why standards, support, and conformity capacity, and particularly investment partnerships, matter. Digital circular economy and e-waste management, again, offers significant opportunities and challenges. If we're serious about cutting the footprint of digital, we have to ensure that there are recover materials at the end of the life cycle. That means designing devices for durability, for repair, building formal collection and recycling systems, and regularizing trade in secondary raw materials. Now, there are opportunities to establish regional hubs for repair, for refurbishment and high quality recycling, for building reverse logistics and networks, and really being able to create more value from secondary materials. Now, when we go to the second question on trade-related measures, I think there's a menu of options to consider and sequence based on national priorities. Countries could include redirecting subsidies and finance, really shifting support to renewable powered ICT networks, carbon pricing where feasible, to consider carbon taxes that earmark revenue for renewable integration, investment incentives and PPPs, exploring tax breaks and concessional loans, affordable access and location adoption, and really looking at ICT repair inputs and how to promote open standards and compliance, and gradually aligning with energy efficient eco-design and repairability. International cooperation is, of course, very important. Domestic policy is not enough. And so we turn to digital trade agreements. Now, there is an opportunity here to add environmental provisions voluntarily and in stages while preserving policy space. There are also opportunities for international finance and risk reduction, mobilizing concessional blended finance, guarantees, green bonds, the use of green public procurement, technology transfer and co-development. Equity-based partnerships are particularly important, research and development skills, and combining North-South with South-South cooperation. So solutions are affordable and are really adapted and fit local context. Circular trade governance, again, developing common classification for hazard, non-hazard, e-waste, goods for repair and reuse, and implementing the Basel Convention rules with capacity building for regulators. So in short, this cooperation lowers the cost and complexity and will help and support developing countries participate on fairer terms in the net zero digital economy. Thanks, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Nadira. Sorry for messaging you at the last 2 minutes. But thank you so much. You identified the dual nature of digital, how it can be useful, but at the same time contributing to the carbon footprint, and expected to grow this carbon footprint of the sector as we use more AI and more digital solutions. And you identified 5 clear pathways for decarbonization of the sector and identified opportunities and challenges that developing countries are facing, highlighted real experiences from Kenya and other countries that are now trying to gain traction of being a green data center hub. So there's real opportunity here, and identified a list of a plethora of policy tools that can be considered in international cooperation. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Patrick, the floor is yours on textiles, 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. And yeah, thanks for TESS for inviting me. And it's great to meet the other authors. Also great to meet the representatives from the permanent missions. So very happy you're here and to have the dialogue with you. And maybe to start, although the reports were on opportunities for developing countries, this is not meant to say that the task of decarbonizing the textiles value chain is only on developing countries. It really needs cooperation between producer and consumer countries with the brands and the SMEs. So, and there's a lot of need for intensifying the cooperation. And with the papers, we try to make maybe some suggestion how this cooperation can develop. Maybe start with, so I guess textiles and garments have been a little bit, haven't received a lot of attention in the climate discussions in terms of decarbonization. Lots of other sectors are maybe considered a lot more. And as part of the report, for example, I've tried to look at the NDCs and where textiles and garments are mentioned. And actually, I could only find the example from Pakistan where it was mentioned, and that there's need for public-private partnerships to address that. In terms of maybe some of the trade-related measures that we might see, so for example, CBAM is being put in place, but there have been discussions on including textiles, but I don't think this is happening at any time soon. So it's more maybe the need of some of the brands looking at their Scope 3 emissions. They will then also look at their producers, the SMEs in their value chains. And so that's then when the energy mix becomes relevant. I know there are many initiatives underway already on decarbonizing factories through solar panels that can actually decarbonize the electricity. There are challenges, though, in terms of the other energy that's needed for heat, like different boiler technologies. So that's a little bit harder. In addition to, I guess, climate-related policy, I think other drivers are more important also from the European perspective. and we talked about this in other sessions earlier, is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. So how to bring more circularity into textiles and garments. So there are some very specific product design criteria that will be coming up over the next year or so. That will then also have, let's say, implications, or they're also relevant for the carbon footprint. This also links to the digital product passports on traceability. Maybe also then link to the other topic that we just heard before about the digital economy and how this is an enabler for also other sectors. Then when we think of textiles and garments, there's also the end of life. And that's, again, these are different countries importing used textiles from Europe for either resale, but as we know, a lot of these are also then wasted. And I just recently, also here in Geneva, had the opportunity to talk to a researcher from Chile, which receives a lot of end-of-life textiles that accumulate in the Atacama Desert. And what's happening there on a regular basis is that these huge textile waste mountains are just being burnt. So that's a carbon footprint that's, I think, totally unaccounted for. So there will be then also coming from European policy new let's say, criteria for how to make this trade in secondhand textiles more traceable and more accountable. Is that 5-6 minutes, or do I have a bit more time?
You have 1 or 2 minutes.
1 or 2 minutes. Okay, maybe just on the trade-related measures very briefly. So there's opportunity where we can work on mutual recognition, cooperation on the digital product passports and the standards. We talked about interoperability in a previous session. I think that'd be useful. Peter mentioned actually green premiums. I think that could also be something for textiles. So can you get green premiums for circular textiles with recycled content, or premiums for garments that are more durable? And how can this be integrated maybe in new trade agreements with Europe? Probably also other consumer countries, but at the moment it's mainly Europe that is developing policies on that. Maybe one area on investments. I think that's also an important scope where more cooperation can be explored, especially with the European Investment Bank. European Investment Bank is looking at circular textiles, circular garments as one of their areas, and they're looking at investments in new recycling facilities, infrastructure for circularity. So these could be good opportunities then also to attract investments to upgrade facilities and other things. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Patrick. You took us across the supply chain of the sector. You highlighted a very interesting fact that the carbon footprint of textiles waste is not accounted for. And you suggested some positive incentives for the sector to cope with the transition. And you actually also highlighted some very practical opportunities for cooperation on investment. So thank you so much. I will now move to our delegates in order to share their reflections and potentially their national experiences on the transition in those sectors and their views on potential trade policies, interests, and trade cooperation where they see priority should be. So I'll give the floor to Naeem. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I would start by thanking TESS for giving me this opportunity to address distinguished people here. And I would like to thank all the authors for wonderful presentations and wonderful analysis of the sector. With regard to I would like to speak about the textile sector. And I would like to special thanks to Patrick for bringing Pakistan's case, particularly mentioning examples from Pakistan in your report. From the economic perspective, Pakistan's textile sector is the backbone of the country's economy. Yet, as we speak today, nearly all cotton producing regions in the country, in the province of Punjab and the Sindh province, they are struggling with very extremely high floods. It means that both the cotton producing areas as well as the people whose livelihood depends upon textile sector are highly vulnerable to climate shocks. In the next maybe 2 to 3 minutes, I will speak on particularly 4 areas that are very relevant for Pakistan's textile sector. Number one, the socioeconomic significance of the sector. The textile and apparel sector is the most integrated, vertically integrated value chain in Pakistan's economy. It links agriculture through industry to the export markets. So it contributes more than 8% to the national GDP. It employs more than 40% of the industrial workforce. And it contributes more than 50% of the country's export earnings. Beyond the numbers, the sector also is a source of livelihood for millions of people across the country. Second, climate-related challenges and opportunities. The textile sector's competitiveness comes from the skilled workforce as well as local production of cotton. But sadly, as I said earlier, both the people and the cotton production are highly vulnerable to climate shocks. And in this context, the recent floods of which I'm speaking about are estimated to cause at least $7 to $8 billion worth of export loss, and including about more than $3 billion worth export loss in cotton and other textile items, which will put more pressure on the textile garment producers to import to meet their demands, which will ultimately result into more trade deficit, as well as maybe contributing on more poverty in the rural Pakistan. From the other challenges from the climate aspect is, as Patrick has mentioned in his report and in his presentation, that the sustainability related standards, circularity, and the CBAM related measures, they will affect market access by increasing cost for firms. That will definitely shift the competitiveness of Pakistan's textile sector. As you may be well aware, that textile is a very price sensitive sector. So even a small increase in the cost will make exporters uncompetitive in international markets. And I would like to highlight here, Pakistan's textile exports, about 75% of Pakistan's textile exports are destined or directed only to 3 jurisdictions: the EU, the US, and the UK. So any change in these jurisdictions will definitely have a very negative impact on Pakistan's textile sector. And thirdly, I would like to mention some domestic measures both the government and the private sector is taking to on the pathways to net zero. That include, for example, as maybe my government has taken a hint from your report. Recently, only last month, government has announced a new textile and apparel policy that is yet not published on officially, but there's been circulated for seeking comments from the relevant public and private sector. They have announced, the government has announced the establishment of National Sustainable and Circular Textile Council. The council will be tasked to devise countries' strategy on sustainable and circular textiles, and the policy has also identified the establishment of a national industrial traceability system to ensure the DPP, the digital product passport related compliances, as well as the other measure that the government has announced in that policy is concessional loans for energy transition, as well as meeting other certification-related requirements. The private sector, the leading private sector, the exporting firms, what they are doing, they have, for example, the firms have invested huge sums in green energy, for example, solar panels and wind energy. They have been investing in certification and circularity. For example, a company has recently introduced and launched a new brand called Second Life that actually uses the worn out denim garment to produce refurbished denim garments, as well as other certification and conservation and emission related commitments the industry is doing that include, for example, Net Zero Pakistan initiative, carbon disclosure project, and other water conservation measures like nanotechnology and rain harvesting. But these measures are being taken only by exporting large manufacturing firms. Small and medium sector SMEs, they are unable to comply with these standards, meaning thereby, if they will not be able to comply with all these requirements, they will be excluded from the export market. And keep in mind that the SMEs dominate the entire value chain of the textile sector. I will take last 1 minute to say what about the international cooperation we are looking for. Fourth, international cooperation, which makes the market, from the international cooperation, we expect that the markets need to be more predictable and accessible for textile exporters, particularly for the developing countries. From the WTO, as a member of the WTO, from the WTO, we expect that it should play a role in shaping international policy framework that is equitable, flexible, and consistent with the WTO rules, and play a role in capacity building and access to necessary environmental technologies and financing that is required for making to achieve these climate objectives. And we also expect that the organization, the WTO, must resist unilateral actions in the name of trade and environment, and keep sustainable development at the core of all discourse on trade and environment. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Naeem, for sharing exclusive information about some of the government actions on the textile sector in the context of the transition to net zero. That's very valuable for us. I'll now move to Kekalisto. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yasmin, and good afternoon, everyone. I think I'll start off by saying it's a pleasure to contribute to this timely discussion, and I'd like to kick off also by saying that I think a number of the points that have been raised by the speakers resonate with South Africa. So I won't necessarily be focusing on one specific sector, but what I opted to do is basically pick some common issues that basically cut across all the sectors, which I feel resonate with South Africa. I'll start off by saying, I think in terms of the key trade-related transformations that we've witnessed and the challenges that we are experiencing. One, I think like other developing countries, we feel that the challenges are quite profound that we're currently experiencing, and they cut across various sectors, including the 4 sectors that we are discussing this afternoon. Because our sense, I think, is that the global climate commitments are basically having an impact, I think, on technology, on market access, and I think also on global value chains. Secondly, from the South African perspective, we feel that this move towards net zero is also driving demand for strategic minerals and also low carbon products. It's also expanding digital trade opportunities and also altering consumer preferences when it comes to textiles and manufactured goods. Thirdly, what we've noted is that it's also creating avenues of opportunity for South Africa, avenues of competitiveness for South African exporters and innovators. However, this is also followed by the fact that it's also testing our ability as a country to adapt and also integrate into the sophisticated global value chains that are currently before us. As South Africa, we've also noted that in terms of these transformations, it means that we also need to be flexible as a country. We need to diversify, and we also need to have continued investment in skills and in infrastructure. And I think also in terms of compliance, because we believe that these are very vital for developing countries to be able to seize the emerging opportunities that are currently arising and to also avoid our marginalization in global rules and market standards. So in essence, I think as point 5 and 6, I'd say that as a country, and I guess other developing countries, we feel that we have a dual imperative of pursuing climate resilient development, but also remaining competitive and integrated in the global market. And then we are currently experiencing or navigating this very complex web, but a very necessary path that we have to undertake in terms of growing the economy, cutting emissions, and keeping our industries globally competitive. So these are transformations that are basically taking place throughout these 4 sectors that we're focusing on today, but also other sectors that we participate in. Now, in terms of response and what South Africa is doing with respect to these transformations, I'll highlight that South Africa is basically advancing a climate resilient development approach where we're trying to connect trade and energy and industrial policy, because we also take note of the fact that trade can't be climate blind. The two go together. And our approach basically puts industrial policy at the core of our response to the trade and climate nexus, so that we ensure that we have a trade and climate resilient strategy in terms of how we address the current challenges we have. In addition, what South Africa has is we have a series of master plans that focus on a number of sectors, including the 4 sectors that we are focusing on today. And what our master plans essentially do is basically put industrial policy at the core of our response. What we seek to do is to promote industrialization. We also want to have economic growth and promote jobs and basically tackle unemployment. We want to develop local value chains and regional value chains. And we want to basically also increase local market optimization and regional development. And hopefully we can do that through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We're also seeking to improve our infrastructure, industry transformation, and develop industry technology and industry skills, because skills will also be important as we move up the value chain. Now, I think more specifically in terms of the master plans, I think in terms of the energy master plan, what we seek to do is basically transition from coal to renewables. And we aim to scale up renewables whilst we ensure a shift away from coal. So what we also want to do there is expand, for instance, our electricity grid, and also develop industry producing key components like wind turbine towers and solar. In terms of critical minerals, we seek to promote local beneficiation. And we're trying to position South Africa as a key global supplier of green transition minerals. For instance, your green hydrogen powered mineral processing, so as to increase competitiveness and reduce carbon intensity. And I agree with Peter, South Africa does have a large reserve of manganese, but it's not only manganese. There are other critical minerals that we have, like vanadium, platinum, and other rare earth elements. And these are quite important components and ingredients for manufacturing, even in terms of clean energy systems and storage. And we believe that these could be locally produced. South Africa already produces solar panels, steel towers for wind turbines, and electrical cabling. And Local firms are also assembling a number of inverters and balance of system technologies for solar and for battery systems. So we believe that there's potential to grow renewable energy industries in South Africa and hopefully also regionally. I think additionally, in terms of critical minerals, I agree with Peter saying that there's opportunity in terms of developing countries and how they use their raw materials. So for South Africa, our view is that opportunity doesn't just lie in having the raw materials themselves, but also in terms of how we advance in the global transition, how we move up the value chain so that we are also able to produce value-added goods and not just a source for raw minerals. In terms of the textile sector, we also have a master plan where our focus is basically on sustainable textile manufacturing and regional sourcing. And our emphasis in terms of the textiles master plan is basically focusing on nearshoring and sustainable production and regional value chain development. So we are also focusing here on the AfCFTA agreement and hoping to develop our textiles sector there, especially in terms of SADC countries and how we shift global sourcing to regional sourcing. And then last year, I think in terms of digital technologies, we are, or rather, let me say our master plan is basically focusing on climate smart services and green tech exports and how we can promote green innovation and digital capabilities. And we're also trying to assist SMMEs in terms of ensuring that they actually can fit into global value chains and also participate. I think in our response to the current challenges, we also note not only the challenges, but also the risks that we have to face. Developing countries have to face a number of risks, one of which I think is the recent unilateral measures that arise, I think, when it comes to trade and environment, for instance, your CBAM. And this basically affects a number of sectors in a number of countries. For South Africa, it affects our steel sector, our energy sector, our cement sector, which are basically going to face high exposure to the new EU measures. But how we are also responding to that is we also have a just transition framework where we are also aligning trade and climate and industrial policies. We're also looking at this, including our Carbon Tax Act, where we are also looking at emissions monitoring and reporting and industrial decarbonization. And we're also working to support SMMEs and exporters as well. And I think lastly, on the issue of cooperation, I think ours would be to say that international cooperation, I think, needs to be at the center of any global response in terms of the trade and climate nexus. At the WTO, South Africa has always advocated for trade rules that are transparent, that are inclusive, that are science-based, and that are development sensitive. And I think these are very important components. We've also called for the necessary technology transfer, because for countries to be able to mitigate, they need to be able to adapt. But for countries to be able to adapt, they need the necessary technology. But for them to have the necessary technology, they also need appropriate and adequate financing for them to ensure that they have the necessary technology to do so. So we need appropriate climate finance, and we need capacity building, both from the WTO and the UNFCCC. And I think lastly, I'll end off by saying that we're also looking at regional opportunities through the AfCFTA, where we can support renewable energy markets, we can support regional value chains and build regional grids and industrial policy growth, but whilst ensuring that our regional approaches are also aligned with sustainable development and global international practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kekele. So, I mean, you shared a lot on the actions that are being taken by South Africa in the 4 sectors. So that's, thank you so much for sharing this. And at the same time, you also highlighted regional opportunities that South Africa is seeking. And if you would allow me, I would like to quote you later on I'll take that quote from you. Trade cannot be climate blind. Thank you so much. Noor, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yasmin. I also would like to start by thanking the TESS for this panel and also the writers and the presenters for their sharing these very valuable information with us all. I would like to focus on energy transition and textiles from Turkey's perspective. Like many other countries, energy sector has the highest emissions share in Turkey's total GHG emissions as well. As presented in the related article, net zero transition in order to be able to achieve a net zero transition, reduction in fossil fuel usage and production is necessary. And to do so, there's a need to increase energy efficiency and renewable energy capacity. And this seems to reflect the pathways in many of the action plans and strategies adopted by Turkey so far. Besides its renewed NDC and its development plans, Turkey has prepared a climate change mitigation strategy and action plan, as well as national energy efficiency action plans, which encompass energy transition as well as industrial transformation. They aim to increase energy efficiency and usage of renewable energy across all sectors within Turkey. And also establishing an emission trading system has been affirmed by the climate law adopted on July 9, 2025. As the EU is the major trading partner of Turkey, especially after the adoption of the European Green Deal, these transformations have been considered essential not only for the net zero transformation, but also to preserve the export competitiveness of Turkey and Turkish products within the EU market and protect the share in the global value chains, as well as increase FDI inflows. So, however, accomplishing this transition is not that easy. As of 2024, renewable energy sources constitute 59.4% of Turkey's installed capacity by energy source and generated 45.5% of the electricity consumed. However, 70% of Turkey's total energy use still comes from fossil fuels. So Turkey relies on imports of these fuels to meet the growing energy demands, and analysis shows significant underutilization of available renewable resources. But this transition needs to take into account considerations of feasibility, market conditions and energy security, and significant infrastructure investments and access to necessary technologies are needed. Trade can provide both opportunities and challenges in this regard. On the one hand, through trade, it will be possible to acquire necessary technologies and products more affordably. Furthermore, steps toward decarbonization of energy, besides helping reduce imports, will help decrease the carbon footprint of the industry, and this potential will increase the share in global value chains and attract more FDI. On the other hand, having to comply with the pace far faster than the conditions of Turkey's economic development can hinder national energy transition policies, will enforce premature action on some sectors and result in failure in the transition process. The resources to be allocated to these premature areas will deduct from the efforts that are needed elsewhere. So international cooperation in this sense is important in order to be able to develop policies that are fit for developing countries' needs and interests as well. And also significant amount of investments and financing is needed in all developing countries as well as in Turkey in order to be able to achieve these transitions while maintaining economic competitiveness and ensure sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Coming to the textile sector, in textile sector, again, as indicated in the provided report, to reduce emissions, Turkey also adopted strategies and plans both to implement circular practices and increase energy efficiency in manufacturing and investments in renewable energy. I'll be focusing more on the circularity aspect of Turkey's policies. Although in Turkey's review, NDC textile sector is not specifically mentioned, a general reference is made to the industry. And in the 12th development plan, actually includes actions specific to textile sector in order to achieve the net zero target. And since the EU is the main export market for our textile and garment products as well, as part of the development plan, policies have been developed to adapt to the EU Green Deal regulations, including eco-design, digital product passports, and waste collection. Furthermore, in the climate change mitigation strategy, we also have plans to reduce the carbon intensity of the textile products. In 2022, clean production practices in textile sector have been adopted in order to adopt circular policies within the sector. Also, best available techniques refers to document will be prepared in the textile sector as part of our industrial emissions management regulation, which was adopted this January and will enter into force on 1st of December this year. So we also, in order to be able to adapt to the EU policies, we also try to enhance our waste collection practices, and therefore Turkey needs to increase its domestic investments in textile waste collection, separation and recycling, and at the same time establish legislative arrangements that will ensure the imports of waste textiles if needed, because it seems that the domestic resources won't be able to fit all the demands of the sector with the application of EU's policies regarding the recycled ingredients requirements. So considering all these, it's international cooperation comes to the forefront in our textile circularity policies with regard to our textile sector. Besides finance, of course, international cooperation is needed to ensure interoperability of standards and mutual recognitions, and collaboration is needed, for example, in establishing rules and determining HS codes separating textile waste and second-hand textile products or reused recycled products. And better international cooperation can lead favorable outcomes for developing countries and ensure adoption of policies within the capabilities of developing countries, so in their helping their pursuit to sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noor, for sharing the experience of Turkey in those two sectors and highlighting that Turkey was very early impacted by some policy actions for climate change since the EU Green Deal and more broadly. So thank you so much for sharing this experience and highlighting key areas for cooperation. I'm gonna open the floor for questions and or urgent comments, but I would request that would be very short so that we can allow a round of final remarks by our discussants and panelists. Thank you so much. The floor is open for questions. If no questions, I can go back to our panelists who were ready already and wanting to do some final remarks on some of the information shared by delegates with us today. So I'll go back to Patrick, please. Can you share your final remarks and responses to what you've heard so far from Pakistan, Turkey on the textile sectors, and South Africa as well, who's concerned with the sector? Thank you.
Yes, maybe I start with a brief remark on some of your mentions, actually, because you were talking about some new upstream, or let's say added value manufacturing that you're looking at in South Africa on assembling inverters or producing wind turbine components. I think all of that is really relevant because it also reflects some of the discussions I participated in last week. I was in Abuja in Nigeria, and it was meeting with also representatives from South Africa. So it's kind of like the next stage of the energy transition. It's not only, I guess, about how do we import a lot of the low carbon technologies that we need to decarbonize, but actually how do we bring manufacturing to Africa? So I think that's a important agenda where we need a lot of discussions on what are the right policies to achieve that. So yeah, this is something we're very interested in at Chatham House, to support that type of discussion and find solutions. And then on textiles, so yeah, thank you very much for the feedback on the report, but also the additional explanation on both in Turkey and the situation in Pakistan. This also very much resonates with the work that we're trying to facilitate between European level policy making, and then also how to make this work without trade disruptions, without impacting also livelihoods and working say the SMEs, especially as you mentioned, it's difficult for the small suppliers to implement many of these practices. And so we're also happy to continue to engage. We're working with different development actors, including UNIDO, also GIZ on the German side is very interested in providing technical assistance. Also with the European Investment Bank, we've been working in this case in Bangladesh, but I know EIB is also interested looking at Pakistan. So these very concrete initiatives, I think we can try to support also going forward.
Thank you, Patrick. Nadira?
Yes, thank you so much, Yasmin. And I think just in terms of last reflection, just to emphasize the importance opportunities that digital brings for developing countries to align trade with climate action, and the need for deliberate choices. In the absence of those, digitalization can entrench divides. So of course, we understand that for developing countries, the high upfront costs, the weak grids, the financing gaps, limited access to green technology makes the net zero pathway a challenge. So I think what matters now is really looking towards ensuring affordable access to green and circular technologies so that developing countries can participate fully in the digital green transition, to unlocking affordable finance to de-risk renewable power digital infrastructure, particularly the data centers, networks and cloud services, capacity development, incredibly important, and the equity-based technology co-development and transfer that really builds domestic value through skills and knowledge sharing. And these and other interventions that are outlined in the briefing note can support developing countries to attract investment, to move up value chains, so that building a net zero digital economy is built with developing countries and not around them. Thanks, Yasmin.
Thank you, Nadira. And Peter.
Thanks, Jasmine. Thank you very much, Kikilitso, and in particular for your comments around the critical mineral side and for pointing out how well endowed South Africa is, including on the storage side with vanadium and other minerals too. A couple of very quick points. I think I didn't speak about the need to decarbonize the sector of critical mineral production very much, which of course is a key issue for many of the sectors in South Africa, with the sort of traditional coal-based economy and strong moves away from that with the just energy transition framework and all the politics and the difficulties and the sensitivities and so on that comes with that. But just to point out that the critical mineral sector at present is responsible for around 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so it's significant. That's mostly in the downstream processing, and it's mostly in the aluminium sector. Some of that aluminium is used for the technologies of the future that we need, the renewables and the electric vehicles and so on, and a lot of it isn't. Yeah, so it's a mixed portfolio there. I think one element that came out again very strongly from South African perspective is around industrial policy and the many master plans. I'm familiar with some of those, but by far from all. And I think it's fair to say that industrial policy is now kind of allowed again. You know, WTO in town fought an action for 20 years to try and say, let's not do industrial policy, and let's make sure that everything is world market and free trade and all this sort of thing. We see from the actions of the bigger members now that industrial policy is allowed. You know, US is doing it, China's doing it, EU's doing it, everyone's doing it. And I think a couple of reflections on that. Firstly, that industrial policy experience shows, you know, two main things. Firstly, that it's in no way is it guaranteed to succeed. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and we know a bit more about that. But it also shows another thing, that if you don't try, you get nothing. And I think that's an important perspective at the moment, that for developing countries to get into these future value chains without a particular policy, if you want to compete on markets, in current markets, it's incredibly difficult. And those markets are very well supplied with high quality, cheap product. It's reliable, it's good. So, you know, countries need some space in order to get into these sectors. And I think that the final point I'd make with that is just around the risk side of this. You know, on the critical mineral side, if the US and so many other countries want to secure their access to these minerals, then let's try and make sure that they get the risk of their development as well. And I think that's the sort of the key aspect here. You know, move away from the old model of the, you know, the mining country takes a lot of the risk and a lot of the environmental and other impact, and try and share that around a little bit more. And there should be opportunity if the countries are very serious about how strategic these are, that, you know, they should be willing to pay the price for them.
Thank you, Peter. Ellie.
Thank you. I just want to say a huge thank you again to the three of you for being here and sharing your expertise with us. It's reminded me that I don't do this kind of thing enough, and I really should be listening more to your perspectives for the work that I do. So I guess that's like a ask and an invite to continue the conversation beyond this. But really grateful for your perspectives. I think there's three things I wanted to pick up on. One was about the point around the kind of joint imperative, so finding the kind of mutually beneficial outcomes that do exist in this space, particularly in the energy transition space, to facilitate climate resilient development. So whether that's looking at kind of bilateral trading partnerships, I think somebody mentioned the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership between the EU and South Africa as one example. Looking at ways that you can, you know, relocate certain aspects of renewable supply chains to facilitate growth and export opportunities for developing countries, and also deliver on EU or developed economy objectives such as reducing costs, competitiveness, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned there, and that those kind of models can be scaled up and used more broadly. Another point I wanted to pick up on was something around predictability, and I think just reflecting on, you know, the trade uncertainty that we have seen over the past year, and the impact that all of that has on the conversations that we're having today. I think there's really a question of kind of trust that needs to be rebuilt in some places between certain trading partners, whether that be at the multilateral level or at the bilateral level, and really making it a question of kind of trade diplomacy and how those conversations are had in a more strategic way. And again, going back to the point of finding win-win outcomes for both sides, which is certainly possible if the intention was there. And finally, I thought I had to pick up on the CBAM point, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I do a lot of work on that. I think it's a real challenge. I think as the use of unilateral measures in this space is increasing, so it's not just the EU, there are lots of other countries looking at measures like a CBAM, and we definitely do need better solutions to make sure that these things don't exacerbate the challenges that we're already facing in terms of the disproportionate impact that many developing countries already face in this space. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellie. And Noor.
Final remarks. Maybe the one thing I have been hearing in all these reports regarding to all these sectors and country perspectives was that we hear a lot of investment, finance, and coordination of policies, and need for international cooperation in all these areas. I suppose we can say that international trade and investment policies must be utilized to facilitate the developing countries' policies in their climate goals, and coordination and cooperation among different policies, taking into account different levels of development and needs and capabilities is essential in this process, and it's also possible through international cooperation. Okay.
For me, I think as a parting shot, I'd say I think it's important for there to be, I think, integrated policy, and I think also regional cooperation. And I'd also say multilateral reform. I think those are quite important. And I think we need to ensure that the global system doesn't constrain energy transition, but rather enables it. I think that's quite important. And I think through the WTO and probably also the UNFCCC, we need to ensure that there's delivery of inclusive global rules, and also I think fair climate measures, and real support for countries, I think, in shifting to clean energy and low carbon development. I think those would be, I think, my parting shots. Thanks.
Naeem.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Yasmin. Finally, I have two remarks. Number one, international cooperation, that is a common thread in all of our today's discussion. I guess international cooperation is the key at the intersection of trade and climate action. And in this regard, from a developing country perspective, when we talk about the international cooperation, it means that implementing jurisdictions and the international organizations working in the trade and environment space, they must provide sufficient technical assistance and capacity buildings to the developing countries and their industries. And number two, for just transition to net zero, access to finance and access to technology is another one of the key areas that has emerged from our discussion today. My second thought, final thought, is that one size cannot fit all. Therefore, the international community must be mindful of the fact that in the design of these trade-related climate measures or climate-related trade measures, by whatever name you may call them, they must keep the development of the developing countries in their view while designing these measures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naeem, and to all the panelists. There is one question. Please, Chantal. Yes, please, Chantaline, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chantaline for BAYAT. I'm just curious because, we did a study with Pakistan that will come out soon, and it's a third of its export in terms of a textile. And one of the major reasons is it's not just trade related, it's not just climate related, it's all these standards of transparency, of reporting, of everything else. So we can't, I'm afraid if we focus so much on just the climate demand, it's not enough because there will be the other constraint. The only way to do it is to look at the NDCs where developing countries have already expressed what technologies and goods and services and finance they would need to do the just transition, to then identify what is it that they actually need. And I think then you have a whole of economy approach, and you're not risking removing one little constraint and then the other one remain, and therefore there's no access to export still. The second comment is I was 15 years in New York and I've grown allergic to technology transfer because it's in every single UN document and nothing has happened. And I think in terms of international cooperation, we need to start talking about access to affordable technologies. And the international community needs to look at what are the necessary technologies and goods and services that developing country needs to do this transition, to implement the NDCs, and then bring to the table those that have the technologies, those that can actually finance the transfer, and have a real discussion.
Thank you, Chantaline. I'm gonna wrap up very quickly by saying this has been very, very enriching discussion. Thank you so much for the delegates for sharing their national experiences. I think it allowed our authors also to have some ideas of what way forward on our research and analysis agenda and our cooperation agenda and coordination agenda to support climate resilient development of developing countries. I learned a lot. I will just mention some keywords that has been brought up very often in the discussion. Investment, finance, technology, integrated policies, regional cooperation, industrial policy, multilateral reform, inclusive global rules, fair climate measures, one size cannot fit all as a key message, a whole of economy approach. But also I want to emphasize that Naeem has he's given us an overview of how the textile sectors is affected by climate change. Net zero, I think, is not only about mitigation and cutting down decarbonization. Adaptation is equally important for developing countries. And so policies can have an implication, adaptation policies can have an implication on those sectors and need to be considered as well. A strategic view is encouraged, and we have experiences by developing countries that can be inspiring. We should try first in order to get somewhere. And I would like to thank you all so much for joining us today. Please join me in clapping hands for our. Thank you very much.